Long before kingdoms were carved into stone and names were etched into mortal memory, the world of Aerith breathed as one. It was a realm stitched together by three eternal forces: the warmth of the sunlit realms, the calm of the moonlit tides, and the silence of the shadowed deep. For 10,000 unbroken cycles, these three powers stood in delicate balance, bound by the ancient pact, a sacred oath forged beneath the roots of the world tree, Eldermist. The tree's silver leaves whispered wisdom to every living soul, its golden roots winding through every mountain, every forest, every quiet village and storm-shaken sea. No creature dared to break the pact, for all knew that to sever the balance was to tear the world apart at its very soul. But darkness does not thrive on chaos alone. It thrives on betrayal, on quiet resentment, on the bitter hunger of those who crave more than fate has given them. Morathur, the keeper of the shadowed deep, had guarded the realm's darkest corners for millennia, tasked with containing the void and keeping its endless hunger at bay. As centuries turned to dust, his heart grew heavy with envy. He watched the mortal races flourish beneath the sun and moon, humans building bustling cities filled with laughter and hope, elves weaving magic and song through ancient woods, dwarves carving grand halls and forging legendary treasures deep within the mountains. Morathur had no kingdom to call his own, no loyal subjects to honor his name, no light to warm his endless, shadowed domain. He began to believe the ancient pact was not a sacred bond, but a cruel chain, one that locked him in eternal darkness while others bathed in endless light. On the night the twin moons vanished from the sky, cloaked by a veil of inky blackness, Morathur shattered the pact. He drove a blade of void stone into the heart of Eldermist, splitting the world tree's core and tearing the three realms asunder. A great roar shook Aerith to its foundations, silver leaves turned to ash and scattered on the wind, golden roots withered and crumbled deep beneath the earth, and a thick, cursed mist rolled across every land. This mist, later named the Whispering Veil, did not merely blind the eye, it stole memories, twisted hearts, and fed on the purest light in every living soul. The sunlit realms faded into endless twilight, the moonlit tides churned into raging, unforgiving storms, and the shadowed deep burst forth, spilling corrupted creatures and void spawn into every corner of the broken world. The ancient races fell one by one. Elven kingdoms vanished into the mist without a trace, dwarven strongholds sealed their gates and were never heard from again, and human cities burned to the ground. Hope became a forgotten word, courage a distant memory. For hundreds of years, the Whispering Veil spread unopposed, and Morathur's shadow grew stronger with every soul it consumed. Only a tiny, hidden prophecy remained, carved into the last unbroken stone of Eldermist's ruins: when the veil devours all light, a child of mortal and ancient blood shall rise from the ashes, bearing the last spark of the world tree's fading fire. This child alone shall mend the fractured pact, pierce the shadow's heart, and either restore Aerith to its former glory, or let the world fall into eternal darkness forever. Chapter E: The Boy Who Heard the Veil's Whispers. In the village of Brambles End, the mist never lifted. It hung low over the thatched rooftops every hour of every day, a cold, grey fog that clung to the cobblestone streets, curled around the wooden cottage walls, and seeped through every crack and crevice until even the warmest hearths felt cold and lifeless. Brambles End was a small, forgotten settlement, tucked away in the farthest corner of the fallen sunlit realms, a place the world had long abandoned. No travelers came here, no traders dared to cross the mist-shrouded woods that surrounded the village, and no one who left ever returned. The villagers lived in quiet fear, surviving on root vegetables and thin stew, keeping their fires burning day and night to ward off the shadowy things that lurked in the fog after dusk. They spoke little, laughed even less, and never, ever listened to the whispers of the Whispering Veil. all except Kale was. Kale was 16 years old, with unruly dark brown hair that always fell into his eyes and sharp, storm gray eyes that saw things no one else could. He was an orphan, raised by Mara, the village's old herbalist, a quiet, stern woman with a face lined by years of sorrow and hands calloused from tending to sick villagers and wilting plants. Kale had never known his parents. Mara had found him as a tiny infant, abandoned on the edge of the misty woods, wrapped in a tattered cloak woven with silver thread, lying beneath a small, dying sapling that never withered, no matter how thick the mist grew. The villagers whispered that Kale was cursed, that he carried the shadow's mark, for he had always been different. While others turned away from the mist and blocked out its faint, murmuring voices, Kale heard them clearly. The veil whispered to him every night, soft, hollow words in a language he did not understand, visions of glowing silver trees, of grand forgotten kingdoms, of a dark, robed figure with eyes like endless void, and of a light so bright it could burn the shadows away. He had learned to hide it. For years, he had pretended not to hear the whispers, pretended the visions were nothing but dreams, pretended he was just another ordinary village boy who spent his days gathering herbs for Mara and chopping firewood for the village cottages. He knew the villagers feared anything different. They had stoned a traveler once, years before Kale was old enough to remember, simply because the stranger could read the old runes carved on the village well. If they knew Kale spoke to the mist, they would turn on him in an instant, so he stayed quiet, kept his head down, and lived in the small, safe bubble brambles and offered, even if every day inside it felt like a slow, suffocating cage. The afternoon the world changed began like any other. The mist hung thick and heavy over brambles and, muffling all sound until the village felt like a ghost town. Kale wandered the edge of the woods, gathering moonbloom flowers for Mara's healing potions, his boots crunching on fallen, dead leaves. The air was cold, sharp enough to make his fingers numb, and the veil's whispers were louder than usual, swirling around his ears like a storm. Normally, he would ignore them, focus on his task, and hurry back to the cottage before sunset. But today, the whispers were not just murmurs. They were a call, desperate and urgent, pulling him deeper into the misty woods, toward a part of the forest the villagers forbade anyone from entering, the ruins of Eldermist's first bough. Kale, the mist whispered, its voice soft and ancient, like wind through hollow stone. The spark awakens. The shadow comes. You must rise. He froze, his hand tightening around the wicker basket in his grasp. His heart thundered in his chest, loud enough to echo in his ears. He had heard the veil speak his name before, but never so clearly, never with such desperate urgency. For a long moment, he hesitated. The villagers had warned him 100 times, the ruins were cursed, filled with void spawn and shadow creatures that would drag any living soul into the mist forever. To step foot there was to walk to certain death. But the whispers tugged at his soul, impossible to resist, and beneath the fog, he could see a faint glow, silver and warm, peeking through the trees, a tiny flicker of light in a world of endless gray. Against every warning, against every fear, Kale stepped into the deeper mist. The woods grew quieter the farther he walked. The sound of the village faded completely, replaced only by the rustle of dead branches and the constant, gentle murmur of the veil. The trees grew taller, their bark blackened and twisted, their branches bare and skeletal, reaching toward the gray sky like grasping hands. The mist swirled around his ankles, cold and damp, but he did not stop. He followed the silver glow, his feet moving on their own, until at last he stepped into a small, hidden clearing he had never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood the broken remains of a massive tree trunk, the last surviving fragment of Eldermist, the World Tree. Its bark was silver and cracked, its branches broken and lifeless, but from its center bloomed a single, tiny silver leaf, glowing softly in the mist. Beside the tree trunk lay a sword, its blade forged from starlight, its hilt wrapped in the same silver thread as the cloak Kale had been found in. And carved into the stone at the base of the tree were words in ancient runes, words Kale could read, without ever learning how. Only the bearer of the last spark may break the veil and end the shadow's reign. Before Kale could touch the sword, before he could process what he was seeing, the mist behind him erupted. A low, terrible growl rumbled through the clearing, and a shadowy creature stepped forth from the fog, tall, twisted, its body made of living darkness, its eyes two glowing pits of endless black. It was a void spawn, the first Kale had ever seen up close, and it had come for him. The veil's whispers turned to a shout. Take the blade. Fight. Live. Kale's hand closed around the sword's hilt. It burned warm against his palm, thrumming with ancient magic, as if the weapon had been waiting for him all his life. He lifted the starlight blade, his hands shaking, and faced the shadow creature. In that moment, he knew his quiet, hidden life in brambles end was over. The prophecy was real. The shadow was coming. And he was the only one who could stop it. Chapter R. The Spark of the Fallen Tree. The void spawn did not hesitate. It lunged forward in a blur of shadow and smoke, its elongated claws slashing through the mist with a sound like tearing fabric. Kale stumbled backward, his boots skidding on the damp, moss-covered stone of the clearing, his breath catching in his throat. He had never held a real sword before, never fought anything deadlier than a hungry forest fox, and the weight of the starlight blade felt both foreign and familiar in his grip, heavy with ancient power, yet light enough to move as if it were an extension of his own arm. Panic flared out in his chest, sharp and overwhelming, but the veil's voices roared in his mind, steady and unyielding, drowning out his fear. Do not flinch. The shadow feeds on fear. Strike true. Kale tightened his grip, gritted his teeth, and swung the sword. The blade cut through the mist with a faint, silver hum, and when it collided with the void spawn's shadowy claws, a burst of brilliant white light exploded outward. The creature shrieked, a high, agonizing wail that made Kale's ears ring, and it reeled backward, hissing in pain. Where the starlight still had touched its dark flesh, the shadow burned away, leaving smoldering, empty void in its place. Kale stared in shock, his heart racing. He had expected the sword to be useless against such a monstrous thing, expected to be torn apart in seconds. But the light of Elder Mist's spark inside the blade was poison to the shadow. The void spawn recovered quickly, its broken shadow flash swirling and mending itself in an instant, no worse for the blow. It circled Kale slowly, its black eyes fixed solely on him, sizing up the boy who dared to wield the light against the dark. It did not growl again. It did not make a sound at all. The silence was far more terrifying than any roar, a cold promise of death that hung thick in the misty air. Kale's muscles ached with tension, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run, to drop the sword, to flee back to the safety of brambles and forget he had ever seen the ruins, the prophecy, or the blade. But he could not run. Not anymore. The second his fingers had wrapped around the sword's hilt, his fate had been sealed. There was no going back to the quiet, hidden life he had known. The shadow had found him, and it would never stop hunting him, not while he carried the last spark of Elder Mist within his soul. The void spawn struck again, faster this time, darting low to the ground and sweeping its shadowed claws toward Kale's legs. Kale jumped, his movements guided by some unseen force, some ancient instinct waking deep inside him he had never known he possessed. He twisted in midair, swinging the sword downward with all his strength, and the starlight blade sliced clean through the creature's torso. Another burst of silver light erupted, brighter than before, and the void spawn shattered into 1,000 wispy shadow fragments, dissolving into the mist without a trace. The clearing fell silent once more, save for Kale's ragged gasps and the soft, constant whisper of the veil. His arms trembled violently as he lowered the sword. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mixing with the cold mist that clung to his skin, and his knees threatened to buckle beneath him. He had won. He had killed a void spawn, a creature the villagers feared more than death itself, with nothing but a sword and a spark of ancient magic he did not understand. But there was no joy in the victory, no relief. Only a cold, heavy certainty settling in his bones. This battle was only the beginning. Kale turned slowly back to the broken trunk of Eldermist, his gaze falling on the single glowing silver leaf still blooming at its core. As he watched, the leaf fluttered gently, and a soft beam of silver light drifted from its edge, floating through the air and settling directly over his chest. The warmth seeped into his skin, spreading through his veins, calming his racing heart and quieting his shaking hands. Visions flashed before his eyes, sharp and clear, no longer vague dreams or distant whispers. He saw a woman with storm gray eyes just like his own, wearing a cloak stitched with silver thread, standing beneath the world tree in its full, glorious glory. He saw her fighting beside elven warriors and dwarven kings, standing against Morather's dark army, sacrificing herself to hide the last spark of Eldermist before the pact broke completely. His mother. The truth crashed over Kale like a tidal wave. He was not just a random orphan, not just a cursed village boy. He was the child of ancient blood, the one the prophecy had spoken of, the last heir of the guardians who had once protected Eldermist and kept the balance of Aerith intact. His mother had given her life to keep him safe, to hide him in the forgotten village of Brambles End, far from Morather's gaze, until the day the spark awakened and he was ready to fight. A rustle in the trees behind him pulled Kale from his visions. He spun around, sword raised, expecting another void spawn, another shadow attacker. But it was no monster. Mara stood at the edge of the clearing, her old face pale and streaked with tears, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the sword in Kale's hand and the glowing silver leaf behind him. She had followed him into the Forbidden Woods. She had seen everything. "I've been waiting 16 years to tell you the truth," Mara said, her voice thin and broken, carried on the misty wind. "Your mother was the last guardian of Eldermist. And now, Kale, you are her successor." Kale's throat felt tight, too tight to speak. He stared at Mara, the only family he had ever known, the woman who had raised him, fed him, protected him all these years, and realized she had been hiding the truth from him all along. Not out of cruelty, but out of love. She had kept him safe from the shadow, kept him hidden from Morather's spies, waiting for the day his power awakened. "The village will not shelter you now," Mara continued, stepping forward slowly, her eyes filled with sorrow and fear. "The void spawn's roar will draw more shadow creatures here by nightfall. Morather's scouts will know the spark has woken. You cannot stay in Brambles End any longer." Kale glanced back at the world tree's broken trunk, at the starlight sword in his hand, at the mist stretching endless and grey across the broken world of Aerith. He knew she was right. His home was gone, the quiet life he had lived was over. The road ahead was dark, filled with danger, shadow creatures, and enemies he could not yet imagine. But he had the sword, he had the spark, and he had a prophecy to fulfill. "Where do I go?" Kale asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. Mara smiled, a sad, gentle smile, and pointed toward the distant edge of the woods, where the mist thinned just enough to show a faint, forgotten path leading far away from Brambles End. To the last hidden stronghold of the old guardians. to the city of fading light. It is the only place left where you can learn to wield your magic, gather allies, and prepare to face Morathur. It is the only way to save Aerith. Kael nodded, gripping the sword tighter. He said goodbye to the only home he had ever known in his heart, turned his back on the village of Brambles End, and stepped onto the path toward the unknown. The whispering veil swirled around him, its whispers no longer frightening, but guiding. The shadow was coming, but so was the last light of Elder Mist. And Kael Voss was ready to fight. The narrow path wound uphill and away from the mist-shrouded woods, its stones cracked and overgrown with blackened moss, worn smooth by centuries of neglect and long, forgotten footsteps. Behind him, the faint outline of Brambles End faded fast, swallowed inch by the churning grey mist, until the village cottages, the small herbalist cottage, and every familiar corner of his childhood vanished completely. There was no turning back, no second chance to retreat into the quiet, unremarkable life he had once craved. The world he had known was left behind, and a world of shadow, magic, and unyielding responsibility stretched out before him, endless and unforgiving. The air grew colder the farther he traveled, the veil's whispers shifting from gentle guidance to low, tangled murmurs that slithered into his ears and coiled around his thoughts. The voices were no longer just the ancient, wise words of Elder Mist. New whispers tangled within them, now hollow, venomous hisses that gnawed at his resolve, feeding on every flicker of doubt in his heart. They spoke of weakness, of failure, of a boy far too ordinary and untrained to bear the weight of a world's salvation. They told him he would fall, that Morathur's shadow would snuff out his tiny spark before he ever reached the city of fading light, that the prophecy was nothing but a cruel lie to lead him to his death. Kael clenched his jaw and kept walking, his boots crunching on dry, dead twigs and scattered stone. He tightened his grip on the starlight sword, its warmth thrumming a steady, reassuring pulse against his palm, a constant counter to the veil's poisonous doubt. He knew the shadow's trick well now. It did not only attack with claws and void spawn. It attacked with fear, with regret, with the quiet lies that settled deepest in a person's heart. To fight the shadow, he realized, was not just to fight monsters, it was to fight the darkness growing inside his own mind. As dusk began to creep across the gray sky, painting the mist in dull, bruised purple hues, Kael reached a desolate, wind-swept ridge overlooking a vast, barren valley. The valley floor was swallowed entirely by the thickest veil he had ever seen, a roiling wall of black, gray fog that churned and twisted like a living thing, swallowing all light and hiding whatever horrors lurked beneath its surface. No trees grew there, no birds flew overhead, no life stirred at all. It was a dead land, corrupted fully by Morathur's influence, a border between the forgotten mortal villages and the broken, war-torn heart of Aerith. Mara's words echoed in his memory, cross the valley of lost echoes before midnight. The veil grows hungry after dark, and the shadow beasts that hunt there do not fear starlight alone. Kael paused at the ridge's edge, staring down into the endless mist below. His stomach twisted with unease, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to hide, to wait for dawn. But he knew midnight was fast approaching, and delay meant death. He took a deep, cold breath, adjusted the tattered pack Mara had pressed into his hands before he left, stuffed with dried bread, a small healing potion, and the silver thread cloak he had been found in, and stepped down the rocky slope into the Valley of Lost Echoes. The moment his feet touched the valley floor, the world went silent. All wind ceased, all distant whispers faded, all sound vanished into the thick, suffocating fog. It was a silence heavier than any roar, a silence that pressed against his eardrums and made his skin crawl. The mist clung to his body like cold hands, seeping into his clothes, brushing his cheeks, and breathing hollow nothings against his neck. The starlight sword in his hand dimmed slightly, its silver glow dimming as if the valley's darkness was slowly draining its ancient power. Then the echoes began. Faint, familiar voices drifted out from the mist, soft and distorted, calling his name. He heard Mara's voice, warm and worried, begging him to turn back before he was out. He heard the village children's quiet whispers, the rumors they had muttered about the cursed orphan boy. He heard his mother's voice, distant and sad, weeping for a son she would never hold. The echoes were not real, he knew. They were tricks, woven by the veil to disorient him, to make him lose his way, to draw him off the path and into the waiting jaws of the shadow. But the voices felt real. Too real. Cale's vision blurred for a moment, his head spinning with longing and sorrow. He missed Mara, missed the quiet safety of Brambles End, missed the mother he had never known. For a split second, he let his guard slip, his grip on the sword loosening, his feet slowing as he listened to the echoes calling him backward. A low, hungry snarl cut through the silence. Cale snapped back to awareness in an instant, his head jerking up, sword raising. 3 shadow figures emerged from the mist, smaller than the void spawn he had fought in the ruins, but swifter, more vicious shade, stalkers, the Vale's most ruthless hunters, their bodies thin and sinewy, their teeth sharp shards of shadow, their eyes glowing with the same endless black as Morath's darkness. They had been waiting for him, waiting for his doubt to weaken his light. No time for fear. No time for hesitation. Cale did not wait for them to lunge. He charged forward, the starlight sword flaring bright once more, silver light cutting through the valley's gloom. He struck fast and sharp, guided by the same ancient instinct that had awakened in the clearing, his movements fluid and sure, no longer the clumsy village boy but a guardian beginning to embrace his birthright. The first shade, stalker, dissolved into mist with a single slash, the second reeled back shrieking as the light burned its shadowed flesh, and the thud heaped into the stone ground with the sword's tip, its snarls fading into quiet nothingness as the light of elder mist snuffed it out entirely. The echoes vanished. The silence lifted. The starlight sword glowed steady and strong again. Cale stood breathing hard, his heart pounding, but his resolve unbroken. He had faced the Shadow's monsters and the Shadow's lies, and he had overcome both. He lifted his gaze forward, toward the far side of the valley, where a faint, distant silver light peeked through the mist, the first faint beacon of the city of fading light, far ahead but finally within sight. Night was falling fast, the twin moons hidden behind the veil, but Cale walked on. The road was long, the enemies many, and the shadow growing bolder with every step he took, but he carried the last spark of elder mist in his soul, a starlight.